Okay, we're going to start the 4 p.m. panel session. But first, Stephen Hartnett has an announcement about tonight.
Hello. Okay. You all know that tonight's session is not here, but at the Agora. There's a map that tells you where it is, and it's not at 7:30. It's at 7 o'clock. Okay. Are there any questions? It'll be in French. Well, not all of it. Excuse me. I think, although they're both French, Rachel and Geneviève will probably be the pre-speakers will be speaking English. But Mario, even for those of you who don't speak French, it's mostly visual. He's a photographer, and he's going to be showing footage of what he does for National Geographic and the work that he does. So, and if there's any need, Rachel, s'il y a quelque chose à traduire parfois, so don't worry about it if. Yeah. And another thing, I should have said before, in fact, I'm going to say it in French. J'aurais dû dire avant que si vous êtes inhibé ou si vous avez des difficultés avec l'anglais et vous voulez poser une question ou faire un commentaire lors des sessions, faites-le en français. Vous avez le droit de le faire en français et puis on va faire traduire ce que vous avez dit. Je présume que vous allez comprendre la réponse en anglais, mais la question ou le commentaire peuvent se faire en français. C'est ce qui est arrivé aujourd'hui qui m'a donné l'idée. Il y avait quelqu'un qui n'avait jamais posé une question. Il a posé une question en français parce que lui parlait français, ou il faisait semblant.
Okay, let me just briefly introduce myself and the 4 panelists for this afternoon's 8-hour session. Just checking that you're listening. It's only 7 hours, actually. I'm Jonathan Balcombe. I'm an ethologist. Did most of my professional work in the United States, but that's significant because I just returned to Ontario 3 weeks ago, where I grew up. Currently living in Belleville, about 3 or 4 hours west of here. And so let me introduce the panelists. We have, for those who may not have been here when they presented, I'm going to ask them to summarize briefly the gist of their work and or their message today. But first, let me just introduce the panelists. Tomoko Ohyama is here from McGill University, and as is Louis Lefebvre, is also from McGill University. And then we have Barbara Finlay, who we're delighted to have. I don't know if it was on short notice, but you're not on the program, and now you are, which is great. And she's from Cornell University, and I hope she'll share with us a little bit about the grandmother theory. And then we have Mike Ryan, who presented earlier as well from University of Texas. So I guess we'll start with Tomoko, just to briefly summarize what you said today for anyone who was not here.
Okay. So I tried to convince you guys that maggot nervous system, I don't know maggot itself decide or not, but nervous system can process the information, then actually nervous system will choose the specific actions. And I'm not sure this is a cognition or not. Depends on the people how to say, but they have the ability to process the information, then produce a specific actions. I don't think this is a reflex, but it's a lot of argument in the field, I think.
I think what I tried to convince people of is that cognition can best be seen as a tree, and some branches are higher up on the tree than other branches, but in order to understand what happened in those branches to lead it there, you need to understand the entire tree. And the way to understand the entire tree is to use something really simple and operational and count it, so that the lower branches of the tree have zeros and ones, and the upper branches of the trees have 33 and 27. That's what I was trying to convey.
I conveyed nothing whatsoever. but I'll just tell you what I do in general, and so what I look at is the relationship between evolution and development per se, particularly brain development. So that's Evo Devo is the catchword for that, and the idea is to try to figure out what aspects of development can be the subject of evolutionary pressure. Where do things change most, and how do they change? One thing that's emerged from the brain stuff is that duration of neurogenesis and construction of all the other brain parts is probably the major variable of leverage, at least in brain size and things related to that. I've recently gone off into life history, and Louis had something to do with making me think about this particular thing, showing the relationship between longevity and brain size, or excess longevity. The author of the thing called the grandmother theory is an anthropologist, name of Kristen Hawkes, and she's pointed out that there's two things that are quite unusual about human life history. One is menopause, and the other is what I'm working with her on is our very early weaning compared to all other primates. So if we were chimpanzees and you were a soccer mom, a football mom with, and had the longevity, the length of weaning that would be appropriate to chimpanzee, you'd be out there nursing the 8 and 9 year old children, not the 1.5 to 3 years old that happens across cultures. And this has produced this gigantic difference in our fecundity. So our reproductive rate is more than twice of the other primates. And Kristen's argument is the combination of the two. So where brain size and Louis comes in here is it occurs to me that maybe we look at all these correlations of absolute brain size and longevity, and why don't we just reverse our usual causation? Is it by having grandmothers, which would have been the ones with the big brains, because those are the ones with a long duration, that it's the grandmothers that cause the change in brain size, selection on that, as opposed to the usual behavioral complexity thing? So that's a little obscure if you don't get it. But those of us who work with things that are correlated all the time realize that we can change the direction of causation at will, and maybe that could be going on. So.
By the way, I'll take that microphone back.
Yeah.
And you can use that one.
Okay. Yeah.
Distribute it here. Does this work? So it only works if I talk into it? Okay, it's one of those microphones. So sexual selection by mate choice generates this amazing diversity in sexually attractive traits in what Darwin called sexual beauty. So understanding how mate choice functions is necessary to understanding how this diversity is generated. And to understand how mate choice works, we need to understand how the brain perceives mate choice, because beauty is in the brain of the beholder. And what I talked about was various cognitive and perceptual biases that happen with female frogs when they're evaluating and choosing mates, and discussing how this might influence the evolution and direction of sexual beauty.
Well, thanks for the introductions. I should have mentioned during my introduction that this is a very interactive, the idea is to be very interactive. So I think of it as a discussion in the whole room. So you're all part of that. We do have the microphones set up. So if you have any key issues you want to raise, questions for any of the particular panelists, and of course, I encourage the panelists to discuss among themselves obviously in a public way, but we can all address questions to anyone here. So I welcome those, and it looks like we may have one already up there. So we'll start with you.
So I have two questions open to the panel, closely related, so I'll ask them together. While there's many obvious advantages of doing research in a lab, to what extent should scientists go out their way to imagine protocols in which data would be collected from animals in their natural habitat? And also, is most of the research done in animal behavior done in laboratories because of scientific imperatives or scientific conveniences?
Anyone who wants to respond may. Not everybody is not obligated, but anyone who wants to.
Okay, well, we can start at this end.
Sure, go ahead.
And I think it's absolutely critical to know what the animals are doing in nature, how they're behaving in nature. And I mean, obviously, for the work that I'm doing, we're very interested in the costs of certain behaviors. And if we don't know what the predators and the parasites are in nature, then we're missing the most important cost. And one thing that we should think about, there's a number of model systems, and it's an interesting game, an interesting question to ask yourself. Why was this animal used? How did it become a model system? For instance, Drosophila, the answer is obvious, right? Because they reproduce so quickly, because they have limited number of genes and neurons. They have X and Y chromosomes like we do. But once a model organism becomes established, then it's used to address lots of scientific questions, many for which I think they're not necessarily well suited. And a colleague of mine and I were interested in the development of the larynx in frogs because we wanted to compare point mutations in elastin that influences vocal cords because it's related to some diseases in children. And we're writing this for the U.S. National Institute of Health. My colleague said, you know, Mike, it's going to be hard enough to argue that they should fund us to study a frog. But we really have to convince them why we're doing this in a frog, but we're not doing it in the frog, Xenopus, for NIH. And this guy studied Xenopus his whole career. And I said, John, Xenopus is one of the few frogs in the world that don't have vocal folds. But that had never dawned on him.
I want to do a little ad first. Your question is the subject of the Carter Symposium at the J.B. Johnston Meeting for Evolutionary Neuroscience before Neuroscience this year? What? Oh, can you hear? Yeah, that exact question that you asked is the subject of symposium at a meeting ahead of the Society of Neuroscience meeting this year. So, yeah, and I'll be giving one of the talks on that. You can use some model organisms in some cases because there's a lot of fundamental developmental structure that is similar, but I would stop right there. I think a lot of biology, and I'm in the psychology department, most of psychology, I think, has just skipped the critical description step in understanding behavior. In psychology, they farmed that out to anthropology to ask what human beings actually do and give a description of that. And so how many of you have heard of the replication crisis? Yeah, so especially all across psychology and a whole bunch of critical experiments that are done in psych laboratories just simply don't replicate. And what people have responded is to increase their experimental rigor, more studies, duplicate, pre-register, all kinds of things like that. What I think they should do is what they've missed is describe the actual natural behavior of humans in the wild doing this kind of tasks first. That's the sort of reality grounding step that allowed this crisis to take place. So yes, much more natural.
I think in birds, one good example of the problem you're raising is by far the largest brains in birds and the highest density of neurons is in parrots. And there's lots of good research being done in the lab in parrots. But the problem is that we know very little of how they use their intelligence in the wild. And one of the good things with the New Caledonian crow experiments is that they're done in captivity. But we can always go back to New Zealand, and there's teams of people from New Zealand that go to New Caledonia and are able to study it in the wild. So we can switch between. The ideal is to have a system. Mike studies the frogs in the field and in captivity to run experiments. And the ideal thing is to always to be able to go between the two to see if your experiment makes ecological sense, and then go to the lab to be able to control variables. But the problem with cognition in parrots is, how do they use? Alex had very intelligent things to say to Irene Pepperberg. But the problem is how, if Irene wasn't there for the evolution of intelligence in parrots, how did parrot intelligence evolve in the absence of Irene? See what I'm saying? That we need to be able to understand the conditions in which the behaviors that we're going to focus on in the lab evolved.
So I think that all animals survived in the natures, so that they have all capability of the can survive somehow, and evolutionarily they conserved, or keep this behavior or nervous system or muscle or physiology or whatever. Everything, I think that by evolution, right? Then depends on your questions. I think I learned that you should use the super animals. So everyone has a different questions, and depends on the level of the questions, I think we should choose the best animal to answer these questions. And we need to look all the time at the nature, natural behaviors.
Hi. I have a question concerning sentience and irrational behavior. So considering that emotion can lead to irrational behavior, in your opinion, could we use irrational behavior as an indicator of sentience as opposed to simply an organism that reacts to its environment without feeling anything?
I honestly don't know. And one thing to remember is that when we use the term, in animal behavior studies, irrational behavior, we usually put irrational in quotes and define irrational as it's being used in economic theory. And Alex Koselnik has a very important, very insightful article comparing different kinds of irrationality. We didn't do this, but some physicists use some quantum decision theory to model this irrational behavior in the Chungor frogs. So using our data set, they predicted what the effect would be of a competitive decoy, and they were able to predict the outcomes of our experiments very accurately. So in that sense, it's irrational by economic definition, but the fact that a quantitative model would be able to predict this departure from economic rationality suggests that, well, it might be irrational in that sense, but it does seem to be predictable under certain conditions, and therefore, suggesting that it might also be an adaptive behavior. Now, whether or not this has any reflection on emotional state or emotional stability in humans, when humans are making quote-unquote irrational decisions, that would be out of my purview, and it would be uninformed speculation.
Thank you. A what?
Tell him that your question was not about emotions in humans.
No, it was not about emotions in humans. It was because I'm trying to figure out sentience or where to put the line. So for an organism, since sentience is not just reacting to your environment, so if I was wondering if the fact that an organism reacts in an irrational way could be an indicator that it feels something, but.
Well, it certainly could be that. It certainly indicates that the animal is sensing its environment and quantifying and comparing its environment in ways that are different and more sophisticated that we thought. I mean, we have some very simple experiments with these frogs showing that the number of things that need to be compared influence the latency time to the animals making a decision. So, that shows, I think, pretty clearly that the animals are doing some kind of, higher level for a frog, cognitive process than just measuring the amount of neural stimulation in the inner ear and responding to the mate that stimulates the ears better. So I think it does give us some insight into the types and the magnitude of the cognitive analyses that are being carried out. In terms of emotional state, I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't have a question in particular, but and I guess I should have talked about it with Sarah Brosnan while she was here, because she did an experiment with capuchin monkeys where an observer was directly in front of the monkeys. But I was wondering if, because in psychology and anthropology, there's this concept where the observer should be like not absent, but it could influence the patients or stuff like that. So I was wondering if you know about whether it could influence the animals when we are observing them, especially in captivity when we are conducting experiments. I mean, it might be more complicated to tell with maggots, but maybe with birds you could see something like that.
Well, there's interesting experiments just littered all around phylogeny in that sense. So what you can, there was just an experiment out by Karen Adolphs who works on how human infants learn to walk, and she noted that almost all the laboratory experiments on human infants is done with someone directly facing the infant, which happens in the wild very little. So there's one example. There's been some attempts in a lot of the primate studies to look at those effects, and there are big ones. I don't know of anything.
Yeah, exactly. Well, with chimpanzees, for example, between them, they look around to see, for example, if they know there's a treat, they will try to, and if they are subordinate, they will try to wait until the dominant is away and not looking to take it, for example. And I was wondering if the same would happen with humans looking with any species. Of course, it would be more easily to answer the question with primates, but
the Japanese large primate facility, the people there really like to talk about their chimpanzees as if they're some cultural hybrid, because they're quite different just by being in the presence of human contingencies and all sorts of cultural things. So yeah,
I just remember that's why I asked the question, is because we talked earlier about whether in the environment versus captivity, what is the would the results be different? And that's why I'm asking, like in captivity, well, they're in the presence of humans closely watching them all the time. While if you do the same test with cameras, taking the footage of that while humans are away and doing the same experiments, if it's possible, would the results be different?
Yeah.
On the same thread, when I was a graduate student, I remember that realizing the difficulty of getting the animals to, obviously you can't get them to read your research proposal, but getting them to behave as you want them to, in the sense that you're actually measuring what you're looking at. I remember setting up an arena to do playback experiments on bats, and it took a while to come up with the right kind of paradigm, the right apparatus that the bat would actually be making a choice between two speakers instead of trying to get away or something else. And I was curious, Mike, particularly with your arena captive experiments with the playbacks with the arena, Did the frogs just? I mean, when those pictures you put with the you showed us with them in the circle, they look so ready to play the game and do what you want them to do. Is that the case, or was there an issue with them being stressed? It's almost a question of emotion. Were the frogs chill about it? Were they cool with it, or did you have to sort of finesse the apparatus and the setup to get them to behave in a way that you're trying to measure?
Well, the behavior we want to measure is phonotaxis, and the females will only go to a mating call if they're in the process of selecting a mate. So we're very fortunate that the field is meters away from where our laboratory is. So we're taking, and females only come to the breeding site when they're going to choose a mate. So we're getting the animals when they're in the prime condition for choosing. Now, given that, we still have to be very careful. We have to handle them very carefully. We keep them in darkness until we test them. We sometimes play chorus backgrounds to keep them stimulated. But once we get them in the acoustic chamber, and we're remotely monitoring their behavior under infrared, then we're fairly confident that we're having no influence over the choices that they make. And so the female will choose A or B, or she will just not choose. And then depending on the kind of analysis, then we usually don't do that analysis. But that's in stark contrast to the studies that we do with the bats. The bats that we work with, and it's mostly Rachel Page now, and some of my graduate students who are studying the bats, those are extremely smart animals, and they just have to be so careful. So for instance, when they set up speakers, and some of them are dummy speakers, and some of them will have sound coming out. So they'll have the cords plugged into some but not others. What my students and what Rachel do is they put the bat behind a screen, because they're convinced if the bat sees them setting up the experiment, the bat can anticipate where these rewards are going to be. And they might be right. I mean, maybe they're being too careful, but these frog-eating bats are animals, and bats in general, as you know, I mean, they're very smart, very insightful creatures. So we're very concerned about that kind of conformational bias infesting our experimental protocols than we are with the frogs.
Malcolm.
Yeah, so I have a question about, I guess, broadly speaking, the evolution of beauty. And the question is, to what extent you think that sexually selected traits can sort of get spin off into this arbitrary domain, and to what extent there's a leaky membrane to something adaptive. In part, the question arises because Richard Prum's new book on the evolution of beauty makes much of the clubbed wing mannequin as an example of breaks on how far sexually selected traits can go. At some point, they become non-adaptive. So curious about that. And the second thing I'm curious about in this domain is to what extent the evolution of beauty might be convergent across species. Like we find the displays of birds beautiful. Clearly, the females also do of that species. Is that just being anthropogenic, or is there actually something to traits that are beautiful being convergent?
You know, I think there's so if you think about birds and think about bird song, there's certainly a to some degree, shared aesthetics of our human response to bird song and the response of females of the same species to bird song.
With the exception of zebrafinch song.
With the exception of, which I don't even think you should even call song, but if you want to, yeah, that's a real exception. But I think there's a few things that Richard doesn't have absolutely correct. These traits never become, these sexually beautiful traits never become non-adaptive because they are adaptive because they enhance the male's mating success, right? So they're adaptive to the males. Are they adapted to the females? Well, it kind of depends on a case-to-case basis. A lot of times preferences for the females are preferring male traits that might indicate resource quality, that might indicate physical health. But one thing that all females are interested in when they're choosing males based on these traits, they need to mate with the male of the correct species. So there's no question at all that in that sense, this female choice is very adaptive to the females. But the females are assessing these traits given the perceptual, sensory, and cognitive abilities that they have. So there's very strong selection on these male traits to match those sensitivities, those biases in the female. So one reason I got involved with this critique of human language evolution, that I very much think that for a lot of taxa, if we want an analogy to animal communication, it's not human language and it's not human speech, it's human music. Because I think the function of a lot of communication, not all of it, but a lot of communication is more similar to what we're trying to accomplish with music than what we're trying to accomplish with speech.
Thank you.
Stephen.
Yeah, well, I actually had two questions, but now you've given me a third. So why did you sign that article in, was it Nature? If what you meant was music and not language.
Just repeat that, please.
That article that you mentioned that you co-wrote with Chomsky.
Oh yeah, I wish it was in Nature's and Frontiers of something. Yeah, because so my contribution to that was what I sometimes characterize as the Dr. Dolittle approach to animal communication. That we should treat animal communication as a string of words that are quite similar to human speech, and we should look at animal communication from an information theory-based approach, very much like Shannon and Weiner had suggested. And to me, this information theory approach to animal communication I think is very similar to this anthropomorphic interpretation of animal communication as a very simple type of human language. So that was kind of my skin in the game for this critique of language. We did get a lot of bad press, a lot of bad feedback, negative feedback on this.
Okay, we won't get into that article, but this, when you just said that the facility that's the homologous facility, or the one that's shared, or the convergent one, is more like music than language. Are you talking about language or communication? There's no question that language is a form of communication. That's beyond debate. But it's a very special form. This came up on the chimpanzee night as well, but it wasn't very well worked out. In the end, questions were asked about language and answers were given about communication. They're not the same. But if you're just talking about communication, not language, and you're saying that the right modality to think of is music, in what sense is a toccata and fugue in B minor communication in the Shannon and Weaver sense?
Well, I don't think it is. I think it's closer to a mood altering set of behaviors.
Could you say that again? A what altering?
A set of mood altering.
Where was the one who asked about emotion in frogs? Who asked that question? You should have said mood. You could have got him to say something.
But I mean, the little bit that I know about human music, we do know, for instance, that different types of music are associated with different moods. I don't remember the authors of the study, but researchers were measuring the response of males to pornography by measuring degree of erection, and they would play the subjects different kinds of music before showing them the pornographic videos, and the kind of music that they heard before that influenced the degree to which they had an erection, and music that were in minor keys tended to suppress erection more than did some other type, like major music. And there's a whole list in this book that I had. There's a whole list of moods that are supposedly associated with with different keys.
Okay, that's all humans are. Humans are also animals, and suppose they have some mild relevance to this summer school, but we're mostly interested in non-human species. And humans figure into it only in as much as we do stuff to these non-human species. So I have a question for Tomoko. When you spoke, all of the virtues of studying the 6 behavior, 10,000 neuron Drosophila nervous system, Drosophila maggot nervous system are there, and they're to be appreciated. But the part that I couldn't, and the analogies you made, and you shouldn't be timid about it, I think, with cognition are right. All we mean by cognition is the stuff that organisms can do, and I put the emphasis on do. Mood, an emotion, is part of cognition, and it's affect, but it's sentience, but it's not doing. And certainly as far as the doing part is concerned, the Drosophila nervous system is there. But there's one point where the two touch, and that was when you said, when you were talking about that Drosophila are all genetically identical, except sort of random variations, and yet in this, I forget what the experiment was, in a 2-option experiment, there is a point in the nervous system where a decision, you said, is made. And that decision won't be the same for every subject. I assume you don't mean something trivial that randomly there will be differences. I assume that you mean by decision, you mean decision. So what do you mean by decision?
What does it mean? It's very difficult to answer, but
I'm on your side. This is not a question against you.
So my experimentally, that if I put 100 animals, how many animals do action A instead of action B? Then if I put the different conditions, 100 animals, if I put, how much percent of the animal, very statistically how different. That's how they decide, not how, which A or B. That's the decisions, I think. Action
Yes,
A or action B.
But you used, in talking about decisions, you were saying, I don't think it's just reflexes. And right? And you still say that. I don't think it's just reflex. If it just reflexes means it's a sort of a causal system where something comes in and something comes out with a certain probability, etc. You're saying it's not just that. We want to agree with you, but we want to know what that means.
Why this is not reflex, you mean? Because this is these action selections or action decisions are experience dependent. That we know.
But then, so if somebody says, all right, not reflexes, conditioned reflexes, it's
conditioned
still
reflex.
In other words,
okay.
Then do you say, okay, that's all I mean, is that they're not reflexes, they're conditioned reflexes.
So reflex means, what is the definition of the reflex?
Well, ask your panel. I don't want to dominate that. What do you think of as a reflex?
What is a reflex?
A Sherringtonian Barbara.
I want to go back to your original characterization of that question, which is that it was, and correct me if I have it wrong, which is something like that you can't have access or you can't see feelings or emotions or something to that effect, that they are internal states.
Oh, I didn't say that.
Yeah, something
that
like
sounds true.
yeah. Well, I think that basic idea is very misplaced because something I've been working on a book recently with Lisa Barrett, and she her argument is that starting from at least the very original vertebrates, that you have 2 motor systems. You have a somatic motor system that is for moving around, for movements of limbs, and then you have a second second, decision-related nervous system that is manner of movement. And it's all those kinds of things that get put in our category of feeling and emotion. So I might decide that I want to be very vigilant now, say anxious, expend a lot of energy monitoring every last thing in the environment. And that kind of thing is a visceral, allostatic allocation of energy towards functions of that kind. You might decide that I feel tired now, bored, depressed, and I want to save my energy till later. So there's a whole domain of energy utilization, how and when you use it, that we never consider. And I think all of the words that we tend to use to describe it are the ones that are called emotion. So I think we've got to think about this in a different way and bring it in.
Can you translate just one emotion for? By the way, I talk about sentience and not about particularly about emotion. It's the students that keep talking about emotion. Okay, I just talk about what anything feels like, sensations, etc. But could you give me, if you want to talk about emotion, take an emotion, a simple one, anger. Okay.
Okay.
In what sense is anger energy utilization?
So anger is. So you could characterize that, say, in terms of a somatic reflex. I want to raise my hand. I want to punch someone in the nose. I want to bring it back. I want to punch the other one. No, it's not that. So I want to also raise my whole autonomic nervous system up to the rate where I'm generating a lot of glucose. My energy is high. My vigilance is high. I'm going to do everything I can to move as fast as possible. All of those things are going to be described as the experience of anger. I would bet that a lot of those are quite phylogenetically deep in how they're experienced, but all we've been concerned of is whether it's just these very minimal motor aspects of these acts. Just, am I going to touch it or not? I'm going to do this lever or not, or whatever, rather than this energy preparation of the whole organism for what you're going to do now, what you're going to do later, and how you're going to do it.
Is there any counterpart of that?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that emotions, but okay. The maggot case, I have a little bit clear. So the even same stimulation I gave to the animals, always probabilities, okay? Then which means that nervous system is not 100% processing, right? It's not A, B. Which means that there are many layers of the processing, might be neurons, or might be group of the neurons, or might be others. But that's a processing is decisions. That's I call the decisions. So we don't know where decision happened, but the accumulation of the choice is maybe decisions. Makes sense? So but we don't know, it's always probabilities. That's why I would like to say that nervous system choose or select the actions.
Malcolm, join into this. You have to go to the mic. You have to go to the mic.
I guess I'm not sure. Is this sort of like an argument that the animal exercises volition because decisions are not determinate, that they're probabilistic? Is that sort of the point? Is that what you're saying?
So depends on the systems. It might be by the experience or some states. It's all influence to the systems. Then that's why the input, always similar inputs they put into the systems, but output is determined by the systems. If that makes sense. The probability is determined by the system too.
So I would say, so in our case, so we've looked at this very, very carefully with Modner cell firing in fish, and we see a probabilistic recruitment of the Modner fast escape neuron as a function of velocity of the oncoming stimulus. And the source of that variance is at the moment not quite clear, but there's a lot of work by Fetishes lab and others looking at the influence of upstream interneurons that could modulate the excitability of the Modner cell, et cetera. So I guess right now I feel like that variance is kind of a black box. We're not quite sure what goes into the black box, but I think that might be more a testament to our ignorance of the dynamics of the cells at the current time. I'm not sure to what extent, for example, it's purely random. Yeah.
So if the
I
ignorance,
don't think I agree that it's not purely random. That's why I think the system will choose the actions. I think in the end.
but to integrate these two, to use one of your terms, if the uncertainty is reduced to zero, in other words, for a particular case in a particular system, you have every connectivity. So you know all of the causal routes that led to that particular output, even though across populations or over and over it's probabilistic. But for that particular case, you have all of it. Is that all you mean, that we don't yet have that, and therefore it's not a reflex? And when we have that, is it a reflex?
Maybe the following distinction might be helpful. So this is a distinction that Haggard, who's worked a lot in human volition, has made, and some electric fish researchers have followed up with, and it's essentially the idea that you can separate, make a separation along the lines of stimulus-evoked behaviors, where there's a clear temporal relationship between sensory signal input and a resulting output, and internally generated behaviors that have no clear and obvious predecessing sensory input.
So in the Drosophila maggot, do you have a counterpart for both of those, or only for the first in the Drosophila?
So purely internally generated. Obviously, you have stimulus-evoked behaviors. Do you have internally generated?
I studied stimulus-evoked behavior because it's much easier for me to control, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure they have an internal decision by the nervous system.
Right.
Well, yes, but you can't. We're trying to figure out now what decision is.
What the decision is.
So if you relegate it to an internal something, we still have to figure out what's going on.
What the decision is. It's difficult, but what the decision is.
And not just what is a decision, because let's say whatever finally, where you have uncertainty about what's going to happen behaviorally or at a certain point in your connectomy, and then you find out what happened, the decision was made. But what was that? If it's not a reflex of some sort.
What is computation?
For those who are, Barbara, you're puzzled because you weren't here for the Drosophila maggot session.
I think the computation of the systems, the decision, if you cannot say the decisions, but the system computes the inputs and the output. That's for me, decisions.
And we have deterministic computation and we have probabilistic computation, but by everybody's lights, that's both a kind of reflex. And remember, this is a conference on sentience. We're asking, why is it that organisms are not just reflex automata, smart learning reflex automata? The intention was to provoke discussion, not to thwart it. All right, let me have another go and then I'll leave. You know, when you gave your list of 6 things that you could have talked about, but you only talked about 3 of them, Mike, the 4th one on your list was categorical perception. And I would like to hear a couple of words of what you would have said if you talked about that part of it.
Well, so there's very strong selection on females to choose males of the correct species. And different species signal their specific status in different ways, and frogs and a lot of birds and crickets use sound. So what we wanted to know was, to what degree do females generalize the conspecific call versus having a very strict template where the signals will match a neural template that says conspecific. This is very much the learning mechanisms that Marler and Notenbaum had proposed in birdsong. So what we did is we took the call of the Tungra frog and then the calls of 9 other closely related species. When we play the calls of the closely related species to the females will never approach those calls in isolation. We're not comparing it to the conspecific call. So then what we did is we synthesized a whole series of calls intermediate between conspecific and heterospecific. And then we tested female. We refer to that as an acoustic transect. And the question was, there are 2 hypotheses. One is that females are generalizing, such that the degree of attraction of a signal is going to predictably decrease as you get further in acoustic space from the conspecific signal. Or another hypothesis was that there's very strict categorical perception, that the females are relating to that the signal either signals conspecific or it doesn't, and that there was a very strong boundary. And one of the requirements of, as you know better than I do, of categorical perception is that the degree of the salience between 2 signals on either side of this categorical boundary is going to be much greater than the difference in salience between 2 signals that are as different but are on the same side of this boundary. So in most cases, there's no evidence for categorical perception. And up to that point, most of the studies of categorical perception in humans, such as studies with chinchilla, I'm sorry, I'm blocking on her name now.
Pat
Cool. Studies of quail by Randy Deal are looking at how animals are responding to variation in human phonemes. And there was only one or two other suggestions that animals might have categorical perception in their own signals. So alongst one of these transects, we saw a very strong categorical perception that this was a conspecific, then you just go out a little bit and bam, the female recognition falls off the edge. And then you get back into the area where there's recognition, and the difference between signals don't mean that much as long as you stay on the good side of that boundary. But we only found it in one of these acoustic transects. But nevertheless, I think this was one of very few, still very few, studies showing that there's categorical perception in these animal communication systems.
The presence of that all or none, or quasi all or none boundary could play the role of the two Drosophila choices. But in that case, the interesting question isn't about decisions, because that's innate, I think. So in that case, it's not that a decision was made that it's a male or it's a female, but rather, and this gets back to the question that the students was asking about, it feels qualitatively different when it's a conspecific and when it's not a conspecific. That's what categorical perception means. You bounce over a qualitative hump. Categorical perception does not mean categorical discriminative behavior. That would be a reflexive version of it, that give me certain, in that continuum that you're talking about, give me a certain number of J and Ds, and I'll keep doing one thing and cross over the boundary and I'll do something else. That's not, certainly from the human case, that's not what we mean by categorical perception. Green looks different from blue. And if the frogs that are showing categorical perception have that too.
If I can just interject, I should have asked earlier, can someone just define for me, maybe others here, what categorical perception means. I'm not quite clear on it.
Well, Stephen edited an entire book entitled Categorical Perception, so I think we have the expert standing right here.
It's really very simple. If you have variation, and we're talking about sensory variation. Sensory variation, let's say along several dimensions. I don't want to make it along one, all right, let me say it along one continuum. In the case of light, you have wavelength, right? But we see, in the rainbow, we see a qualitative spectrum with frets, like a guitar, that separate qualitatively different colors, even though what's varying is just wavelength. Categorical perception is when the perceived differences within a category of the same physical size look smaller within a category, and the same size difference across the category boundaries looks bigger, right? And that's what they found in that one,
Right.
in that one case. But anyway,
I'm very, very sorry about my insistence in this kind of question it's the same question maybe I have already done before at other session. And because I study emotion, I study the nature of emotion, I study the work of Jaak Pansap, and I really want to know why, what is crazy love? Why put this expression in the title if you are not talking about emotion? Love is a kind of emotion.
Well, crazy love was in quotes.
Yes, is it? It's a kind of
It's a
analogy.
popular song, right?
Yeah.
It's a kind of analogy.
Well, we try. I mean, I try to make the tie between irrational, what's economically called irrational theory,
Yes, I understand.
and make that, and I didn't go through all this in the talk, and make that tie to human mate preferences and how we perceive behavior of people when they are in love. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about the frogs, but this was to make a larger, what I hope was an entertaining analogy. And if you look through popular music, the term crazy and love are put together so many times. So, and in a lot of novels in very different cultures, often reflect on when people are in love, that they make decisions that are hard for us to understand. In a sense, in quotes, and this is meant to be very light, in quotes, crazy, in quotes, nuts, and we just can't understand. I'm sure we've all had friends who will fall in love with another person, and a common saying is, I don't see what she or he sees in him. And when we're studying the frogs, they're making these kinds of decisions, which are not what would be predicted by fundamental economic theory. Now, one might say, well, but you're studying animals, you're studying decision-making in animals. What does human economic theory have to do with that anyway? Why are we so concerned with human economic theory? And the reason is because in analysis of the influence of selection on traits and the evolution of traits, especially in evolutionary studies and especially in behavioral ecological studies, the analyses are often based on cost-benefit ratios. All of foraging theory, all of the initiation of evolutionary foraging theory, going back to MacArthur and Pianka and Emlyn, are all based on this analysis of cost and benefits. So as an economic theory, the assumption, going back to Adam Smith, is that choices of individuals should be to maximize some utility, some monetary utility or some internal feeling of satisfaction. Well, evolutionary biologists, we've taken that paradigm and moved it to selection, and we say even more clearly, animals should be rational in the context of maximizing a utility, and that utility is Darwinian fitness, and that's the the basis of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So that's why I use the term crazy.
Yes, I agree with the expression, and I don't understand why we can't attribute love for animals. I really don't understand that. I think we are skeptical too much. That's the way I think, and I think.
Well, I mean, I agree with you.
Yes.
I mean, there's very insightful studies of development of sexual fetishes in quail by Michael Damian, who's in the psychology department at my university, and others. But through an understanding of how these sexual fetishes develop in quail, they make a parallel, and I think they're correct, to obsessive compulsive behavior and pornography viewing in young males. And there's a lot of real equivalencies there in how the conditioned stimulus might be working, how it might be influencing the dopamine reward system.
Yes.
I mean, that's not love. It's as I said, it's a compulsive behavior. But I think, yeah, and we see animals mourning. We see elephants mourning the death of one another.
Yes.
Some people have suggested they've witnessed funerals and blue jays. And we certainly see in animals that have very tight pair bonding. I mean, going back at least as far as Conrad Lorenz, and if not before, animals that have long-term pair bonding, when one of the mates is taken away, the animals will behave as if they are depressed or if they are mournful. Yeah, so I certainly agree with you.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, just a quick comment on that. Well, emotions have evolved to adapt individuals to certain situations. For example, fear is a like, negative emotion that when you feel it, you have to how do we say it? You have to make sure you're not going to feel it again because it's not a fun emotion to feel. So if you see a predator, you're feared, you flee or you fight or whatever. So love, I guess, would be the same thing, even though maybe we could call it love or lust in animals. Maybe it's easier to call it love in monogamous species, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a good.
Okay, we'll take another question. Is there a question back there? Please.
It's a reflection, maybe, or I don't know. It's a bit long. Just stop me if you think that it's not relevant or whatever.
Can you get close to the microphone, please? Sorry.
Yeah. It's about the flexibility evolving because this is the title of the panel, and following the idea or the thought of Stephen about choice, I was thinking about it. Today, you all talk about some kind of emerging animal feature or like multi-level convergence and integration, perceptual grouping, innovation. Every one of these features seems to have something to do with producing novelty or unexpected thing, not mere reflex or something more than just reflex, maybe or not, I don't know. And I think flexibility has something to do about that. Yesterday, Malcolm told us about sensory volume that play a role in permitting imagination and planning, stuff like that. And that medium environmental entropy favor high behavioral complexity and stuff like that. Maybe every one of these features have different adaptive value, but I just want to bring maybe another perspective about that. Yesterday, Simon warned us about adaptation is just a story, and I think it's a very important consideration. I agree that this is not a simple task to establish what, to be sure about the adaptative value of this kind of cognitive feature, but what if planning, innovation, associative, social, and reversal learning, what if all these cognitive abilities just come from the same exaptative pool that Gould just told us about? I think variation and natural selection are surely the motor of evolution, the power of evolution, but I think that biological constraints channel maybe evolution, so direct the course, the path of evolution. And what if flexibility or choice maybe could be the result of the gap left by these biological constraints. Maybe we just have to think about the problem by the other end. I don't know. I think that maybe studying these constraints could be insightful to be able to understand flexibility, personality, or maybe the possibility of a choice. If the choice could be just the gap leave by these biological constraints. Do you follow my line of thought, or no?
Yes, a kind of. I think I probably understood. So the okay, if I have this animal maggot need to choose A or B action, right? Then see, I looked at different species of the Drosophila larvae, right? Seems like it's not same ratios, right? The action is some species do not roll, but some species roll more, okay? Which means that evolutionary, I think some species do not have to, or right, some species need to be. That's why they evolved the more rolling, choose the more rolling, not fast crawling, right? Then some species maybe not have to be or necessary for this behavior. So maybe they don't roll. But nervous system itself very similar, right? If I looked between the species. Probably, my guess. Because of same Drosophila, same maggot, then which means that nervous system is very similar, but they are different actions they do. Which means that maybe nervous system is the can be flexible. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But
Little
what
bit?
what I want to say is that maybe flexibility per se doesn't have a priori an adaptive value, but a posteriori an adaptive value, and that the adaptive value may be a force driving the evolution of many cognitive traits, but we are not considering the other part of the evolutionary process, the importance of constraint. I don't know if you are familiar with the I guess that yes, with the exaptation concept of
Yes,
Gould.
maybe adaptations.
Exaptations.
Okay, yes, it's right. It's might be yes, but I'm very difficult to prove these questions. I think right now, but I agree. I think yes.
Go ahead. Next question.
I was wondering if there's signs, or if you can just imagine perhaps a role for intraspecies variability in behavioral innovation and flexibility. Something along the lines of there's a cost to the slowness of more complex heuristics, there's a cost to the risks of innovating badly. And maybe there's something going on like you don't have to have the average innovation capacity of a species to be so high, so long as you will always have, say if 5% of your species survives a selection drop, you will likely have enough high innovators as a subgroup in that population to be able to continue on after that selection step. Is there signs of that sort of like not useful most of the time, but a useful reserve in an emergency sort of intraspecies innovation variability?
Let's go back to the example of the Barbados bullfinch and the black-faced grassquit. Okay, so to me, it's more a matter of if you're an opportunistic generalist versus a conservative specialist. These are ways of exploiting food in the environment. And if you're a conservative specialist, the nervous system the way you're selecting and putting into memory cues of everything that's happening around you is you benefit from forgetting. You benefit from not learning because you're going around the grass and imagine the environment, things that are happening right now. There's if you were outside on the street, okay, there's less happening now, but you're outside on the street, there's hundreds of things coming into your brain. And you're the type of animal that is a specialist. So you're not interested in switching between things, you're looking for one thing. So basically, all of this information that's coming in, if you were memorizing it and putting it into your memory and using it later on, it would be a total waste. So the black-faced grassquit, the fact that it overexpresses an inhibitory receptor means that it's not producing the Hebbian networks that correspond to memory. If you're an opportunistic generalist, you're looking for different kinds of food. And when something new comes along, you can, presumably all the individuals in the species have that ability, and some are using it more than others. I'll give you another example after that. So basically, all of this information coming in, it is to your advantage to memorize it. So instead of overexpressing an inhibitory receptor for glutamate, you're overexpressing an excitatory receptor, and you're memorizing things faster. Then you're forgetting them if they're not useful. But to me, it's a matter of how much your feeding strategy requires you to be attentive and to memorize things in the environment. The other issue is when, for instance, we're looking at the grackles that are dunking food. This is something that was seen quite rarely. It had never been reported. We saw it in a few individuals. But when you capture all the grackles and you put them in cages and you give them food, which is only these pellets and only water, they all do it. And in the field, they can all do it. So you create conditions in which you see it in 1% of the population. But basically, they're all capable of doing this. So what you see is not necessarily what the whole population is capable of. And if you remove the individuals that are doing it, someone else, or it's also a matter of the context, the social, the competitive context, the distance between water and food, the exact nature of the food. Basically, over the years, we've been able to understand all of the determinants of that behavior to the point where we can either get it never or get it 90% of the time, depending on how we play around with all the factors that affect it. So even though you see it in 1%, you might get it in 100% eventually, depending on the different conditions.
Yeah, I have, I guess, one question for you about the basis of some of that. And this is the kind of information that I've heard at a meeting and have not seen in a paper since. So what I'm asking is maybe bring me up to date on, which is the work on FOXP2 in birdsong and also in some aspects of mammalian vocalizations. And, of course, the interest in FOXP2 started with humans who were thought to have language disorders as a result. And the result that I heard given for birds was that this is a an upper level regulatory enzyme that a regulatory molecule, and that is was changing the relative proportion of the basal ganglia homologue to rapid learning versus habit learning and sort of locked in learning. And then I thought, is there these two mechanisms? Or I thought that maybe that's exactly what you were talking about. We're just talking about one of the control process, and what you were talking about is the result of that control process. Is that possible? Or do you know this?
It's not something that I know of. Mike seemed to be nodding a lot more than me. So
when
Yeah.
they,
Go, Mike.
Yeah.
I don't know that much about FOXP2. I used to be very excited about it when they first reported it because it was touted as a language gene. And a book that came out shortly after that by John Maynard Smith and Savarsky referred to it as one of the 6 or 7 great evolutionary changes. And they said that this, allowed us to then have language and allowed us to develop all of our social complexity. But my understanding is that it is a regulatory gene. It also influences the gut lining in a lot of animals. It does many, many things. So the folks who I know who work on bird song and think seriously about FOX2 aren't surprised that when you disrupt FOX2, because it has influences on innervation of the face, and this is why it's thought to contribute to problems in speech rather than problems in language, problems in articulating. So it seems the bit of the literature that I do know, it seems that, as you pointed out, it's a regulatory gene that has many, many effects, one of which is it can have an effect on a person's ability to use language because it affects the ability to articulate speech.
Yeah, I completely and totally agree with that characterization with the literature. No one thinks that it's a language gene, but it clearly interacts with language expression. And I think in several species now, also methods of articulation and learning of that. So when you look at the expression of a regulatory gene across a subject, you find a particular species and you find that you've changed the domain over which it's acting in development. That tells you at that point nothing about the downstream consequences of that. But I was very interested to hear this because the relative proportion of GABA and glutamate receptors might be the downstream consequences. And genes are always reused in multiple structures. So the fact that it's used elsewhere doesn't mean that it can't be used as a gradient within one particular learning structure in the brain. So, but we don't know, I guess. So,
because thank you for that. Because our discussion tonight starts, the session tonight starts a little earlier at 7. We'll just take the one or two more questioners who were waiting to ask. Thank you.
I like learning about animal behavior so that I can also learn a little bit about human behavior. But in our case, we are very influenced by culture. And nowadays, we're starting to see how much culture has an impact on our biology. So taking culture into consideration, how much do you think that animal behavior can teach us about human behavior?
Well, I mean, I tell the students in my animal behavior class that the only people who are worried about nature-nurture controversy are social scientists. This is not an issue in biology anymore because you can't really totally separate nature and nurture. You can't, so instead of referring to cultural evolution versus biological evolution, I always think of it as genetic evolution versus cultural evolution. I think cultural evolution is as much of a part of the species biology as genetic evolution. Now, we do know a lot about cultural influences in animal behavior. I think the best example might be dialect variation in songbirds. I think that we might have learned more about dialect variation in birds from thinking about dialect variation in humans than vice versa. So at least from my point of view, I think there's interesting analogies, and I think for a lot of animal behavior, it might give us insights into some human social behavior for sure. But I think it's a big mistake if when animal behavior studies are over extrapolated when you have the animal behavior systems that really have very little cultural or experiential effect on behavior. That's just one opinion.
I think one of the methods that's been really useful to understand animal behavior is the comparative method. And unfortunately, there's only one species of humans, of hominins left. It would be so nice to go back to the times where there were maybe 4, 5, 6 hominin species, and to be able to use the comparative method on the ancestor that will become Homo sapiens versus the ancestor that becomes the robust Australopithecines, for instance, and see what was in their brains or their behavior or whatever, and put them in experiments where they're chewing roots or whatever these critters did. It would be so nice, but unfortunately, there's only n equals 1. The other thing is that we tend to think of the past. We tend to say, oh, human behavior, the reason we have this is that because in the old days, blah, blah, blah. But the question is, what old days? So one graph that I showed said there's constant increase, an exponential increase in brain size from 3 million years to now, or at least 50,000 years ago, because our brains are smaller now than they were 100,000 years ago. And there's no change in the variation around the line. But in terms of body size, there's huge change. So imagine that those huge 160 kilogram individuals were large males and that the smaller ones were females. That means that we were like the primate species that had huge gender dimorphism in size. So that, presumably, given the average rule for the other primates, is we were polygynous. And then there are periods in which there's practically no evidence of gender dimorphism. So unless this is a sampling problem and we just haven't found the fossil hominins that are larger in that period of time, imagine that at that period of time, gender dimorphism was tiny. Today it's about, what, 10%? Okay. So we have a breeding system that is considered to be between monogamy and like serial monogamy. Okay, serial monogamy is the average system in humans. It's not the chimpanzee sort of open system, and it's not the polygyny of gorillas. But imagine that this has been changing over time. So what is the ancient adaptations that we carry to today? We don't know. So I think evolutionary psychology has a lot of just so stories around it because we don't know what the past was. And we also can't use the comparative method because n equals 1.
Thank you, Louis. Do we have one more question? We'll take that briefly and then an announcement from Stephen.
Okay, so my question is just how important do you think the number of neurons is for how much cognitive ability an animal has?
It all depends on, there's a question of what could be the answer and how can we get the answer. So if we're using the comparative method, then we need data sets that allow us to have a sufficiently large database to test the answers. So there was a question today as to, okay, so maybe it's the number of connections. So let's get the data on the number of connections. Maybe it's the expression of receptors, certain subcategories of receptor types at the neuronal junctions. But the problem is, let's get the data. So maybe it's receptor subtypes, expression, maybe it's number of connections. Our ability to answer questions is always proportional to our ability to get the data to be able to ask and test the question. So there are questions it would be really, really nice to be able to solve, but it's not feasible within the next 10 years to say we're going to get those numbers. So yes, it would be a nice thing. So perhaps you can do it. But for the moment,
do you want to answer that or? No. What?
You can use this. You got your own.
Oh, okay. I don't think we don't have to wait quite that long for making a statement about what is useful as metrics of nervous systems. I mean, I have a strong pluralistic view of that, which is you want to measure everything that you just mentioned. And there's a lot of just bizarre debates in the literature about, oh, it's the number of neurons is the only thing to count, or the volume is the only thing to count, or the network structure is the thing that's important. Well, you can rule out every one of those in turn as a single thing to count because, for example, the size of single neurons may vary through several orders of magnitude in the nervous system. A granule neuron in the cerebellum is not the same in terms of processing as a pyramidal cell in the cortex or a motor neuron in the spinal cord. So if you're interested in what is the digital unit of information transmission, it's not a neuron. It can be part of a membrane or something. If you're going to measure, the amount of neuropil or the amount of branches, you can measure that. But they're also getting to be really nice databases, mostly Henry Kennedy and all the network people, where you don't have a whole lot of information about the species by species variation in network properties, cell size, branchingness, and so forth. But we're starting to get a very good idea of sort of baseline connectivity, at least in these mammalian nervous systems. But my particular hobby horse about what we really don't know and what we ignore systematically is all of the subcortical churning of the connections between various reward and motivation systems and how they interact with them with sort of information gathering and motor systems. Really have ignored that as a I think, center of evolutionary motion.
All right. On that note, I think we can say that this is a difficult terrain, and the more we know, the less we feel like we know. There's so many questions that remain. But I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions today.